When one looks at the Golden Gate Bridge, or really any bridge for that matter, one must remember that the engineer designing the bridge must take into consideration three different stresses. These stresses are the dead load, the live load, and the wind load. The dead load is the weight of the bridge itself. The live load is the weight of the daily traffic that crosses the bridge. And the wind load is the stress of storms that beat upon the bridge. The engineer will then build braces that will allow the bridge to handle all of those stresses. Like the bridge, our lives will experience stresses that we often call trials. To build successful lives, we must take into account how we can build up our lives so that these stresses won't destroy us. Today, we're going to take a look at a passage that will help us make sense of the trials that come into our lives. John chapter 6, verses 16 through 21. In verses 16 through 18, we will see how trials begin. And in verses 19 through 21, we will take a look at the byproduct or the result of the trials. Let's take a look at the passage. John chapter 6, verses 16 through 21. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." Then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. Now in verses 16 through 18, we see how Jesus initiates the trial which he is going to send his disciples deliberately into. Now from our perspective, trials often seem random and unpredictable, painful even. But if God is sovereign, as the scriptures tell us, then trials are simply a part of God's plan for us. And that is exactly what we see in verses 16 through 18. So let's take a look at verse 16. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea. The first question we should ask ourselves is, why did the disciples get into a boat and leave without Jesus? Matthew sheds some light on this in Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 through 23, a parallel passage. Immediately he made the disciples get into, that is Jesus, made the disciples get into a boat and go before him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain to pray. The next thing that we need to ask ourselves is, why did Jesus make the disciples get into the boat? It almost seems like he compels them to get into the boat. Well, we see the answer in a verse that we took a look at last week, John chapter 6, verse 15. It says, "Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself." You see, I believe that the disciples were sympathetic with the crowd. They wanted Jesus to be made king. They wanted him to challenge the Romans. But this wasn't Jesus' plan. They were in conflict with Jesus' will. So he made them leave while he dismissed the crowd. Jesus wanted to refuse the crowd's demand that he become king without the resistance of his own disciples. Jesus went up on the mountain to pray because he knew that he had disappointed his disciples whom he loved, and because he knew the trial that was about to overcome them. These men needed the intercession of Jesus. Jesus not only sends us into situations that try us, but he prays for us to be able to overcome the trial. The writer of Hebrews writes something very similar in Hebrews chapter 7, verse 25. "Consequently, he, that is Jesus, is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them." The writer of Hebrews is saying that Jesus, as we're in the midst of our trials, is praying for us, interceding for us before the Father. When you experience a trial and it threatens to overwhelm you, you need to remember this. Jesus is praying for you before the Father. He is praying for you by name. Now, in the next phrase of verse 16, John writes this: his disciples went down to the sea. They would have to leave the mountain where the 5,000 had been fed and go down to the Sea of Galilee because that's where the boat was. John carried this thought on in the next verse. Take a look at verse 17. Got into a boat and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. They get into a boat and they start out across the Sea of Galilee, but then John adds a very interesting detail. He says, it was now dark and Jesus had not yet come to them. So they're alone in the dark without Jesus. John adds this because Jesus, as the light of the world, brings light into the lives of his believers. And when Jesus is not with us, we are in the dark. Jesus is not with them, and consequently the disciples are in the dark. Remember, these disciples were believers. They had a relationship with Jesus, but they were in the dark without him. Now, we can be Christians, but if because of sin we are out of fellowship with God, we are in the dark. But being in the dark wasn't the only part of the trial that the disciples were facing, as we will see in verse 18. Take a look at the verse. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. Now, in order to understand this verse, you need to understand some geography. The Sea of Galilee is relatively shallow. It's really not a very deep lake, and it's surrounded on three sides by hills. They often call them mountains. They're more like hills to us. Storms would arise suddenly and come sweeping down these hills, and because of the shallowness of the sea, the waves would be stirred up quickly and would often become very large and choppy. The disciples were in the dark without Jesus, and the wind was picking up and the sea was becoming rougher and rougher. But even that was not the end of their problems, as we'll see in verse 19. Now, in verses 19 through 21, we're going to see the byproduct, the result of the trials that Jesus has brought into their lives. And one of the important lessons to take from this passage is that Jesus doesn't just send us into trials. He has a purpose for the trial. The byproduct or result of the trial is seen in these verses. So let's take a look at verse 19 first. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened. The fact that the disciples were rowing means that the wind was blowing in their face, because if the wind had been at their back, they would have put up their sails and made it across the 8 miles of the sea relatively quickly. But the wind was in their face, so they are rowing. As it was, they were only halfway across the sea, and they had been rowing for hours. Matthew tells us that it was the 4th watch, which would have made it between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. They had been rowing for about 8 hours approximately. Even if they were trading off, even if they were trading places so that not just a few people were rowing, they must have all been becoming quite fatigued. And don't you think that they were becoming desperate as well? Only halfway across, and it had been hours, and they are without Jesus. Sometimes Jesus waits until we have exhausted all of our resources. When we are out of fellowship and we're trying to save ourselves out of our trials, Jesus will often wait till we come to the end of our resources, the end of our rope, before he steps in to assist us, because he wants us to realize we cannot save ourselves. Only he can save us. Now, Jesus comes to the rescue in the next phrase, but in a totally unexpected way. Take a look at the next phrase of verse 19. They saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat. Now, both Matthew and Mark make it clear that the disciples didn't immediately recognize Jesus. Instead, they thought he was a ghost. The point is this: the salvation of Jesus from our trials does not always come in the way that we expect. We may be praying for a certain result. It may not come that way. Jesus is sovereign. He can choose the way that he wants to rescue us out of our trials. And in this case, he does it in an absolutely unexpected way. Take a look at the final phrase of verse 19. And they, the disciples, were frightened. They were frightened because Jesus is walking on the water. They'd never seen anything like it. They couldn't almost believe that it was him. Now, Jesus didn't intend to frighten his disciples. His intention was to come to them and save them out of their trial. But his appearance was so unusual and so unexpected that his disciples were frightened by his presence. I am sure, though John does not mention it, that the disciples were praying for relief and rescue. But Jesus' answer to that prayer was an utter shock. When you pray for relief from the trial that you are experiencing, don't be surprised if Jesus arrives to save you out of your trial in a totally unexpected way. Jesus does not want us to be afraid in the midst of our trials, as we will see in verse 20. Take a look. But he said to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." Jesus doesn't want us to live in fear. Instead, he wants us to live in relationship with him, to live in fellowship with him. And when we live in fellowship with him, in relationship with him, having repented of our sins and entered into a relationship, we have nothing to fear from our trials. In fact, Isaiah could have been talking about Jesus when he wrote Isaiah chapter 41, verse 10. He wrote, "Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." And Jesus' presence did drive the fear away from the disciples. Take a look at verse 21. Then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. This is probably an understatement. I don't think that they were just glad to receive Jesus into the boat so they could be saved. I think they must have been overjoyed. I think they looked at this as salvation from possible death of drowning. They were overjoyed that Jesus cared enough about them to come walking on the water to rescue them from a situation that seemed deadly. When we are in the midst of a trial, there is probably no event more joyful than when Jesus shows up to save us. Now, in the last phrase of verse 21, it says, "And immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going." Now, I can't guarantee you that restoring fellowship with Jesus and seeing him enter into your life will end your trial immediately as it did for the disciples. But I can tell you this. Number one, when Jesus is with you in the midst of a trial, the trial becomes endurable. And two, when Jesus is with us in the midst of a trial, there is a guarantee. His presence is a guarantee that our trial will come to an end. Now, how do we apply these verses? Let me suggest three things. Number one, remember that Jesus is always interceding for you, even in the midst of your trial. Two, being out of fellowship with Jesus means that we are in the dark. And three, the presence of Jesus brings us joy in the midst of trials. A man found a cocoon of an emperor moth and took it home to watch it emerge. One day, a small opening appeared in the cocoon, and for several hours, the moth struggled but couldn't seem to force its body past a certain point. Deciding that something was wrong, the man took some scissors and snipped the cocoon, and the moth emerged easily. Its body was large and swollen, and the wings were small and shriveled. He expected that in a few hours the wings would spread out into their natural beauty, but they didn't. Instead of developing into a creature free to fly, the moth spent its remaining life dragging around a swollen body and shriveled wings. You see, the constricting cocoon and the struggle necessary to pass through the small opening were God's way of forcing fluid from the body into the wings. The merciful snip was in reality an act of cruelty. Thank God. He knows precisely how much we must struggle in the midst of our trials to become like Jesus Christ.